Welcome to the deep dive.
Hello.
Today, we're doing something a bit different, but I think really useful. We're not diving straight into a topic itself, but into how someone else analyzed a topic.
Yeah, specifically, we're looking at a critique of that analysis.
Exactly. Our source is excerpts from Critique of a Secular Pentecostal Analysis.
It's kind of a meta-analysis, looking at the looker, so to speak.
Right. And our mission here for this deep dive is really to unpack this critique. We want to understand the different types of errors it identifies in that original secular analysis of Pentecostalism.
And just to be super clear up front, this isn't about saying the original analysis was right or wrong or validating Pentecostalism or anything like that.
No, not at all.
The goal is purely to learn from the critique itself, to see the kinds of pitfalls that might show up when anyone tries to analyze a complex subject, especially from the outside.
Right. The source we're looking at, the critique, it argues that the secular analysis it's examining, while maybe making some okay points, has several issues: biases, errors, some questionable assumptions.
And it says it does this by framing religious stuff through maybe limited lenses, sociopolitical, economic.
And then making them logical jumps based on that framing.
Exactly. And what's really useful here, I think, especially for you listening, is that getting a handle on these different kinds of analytical errors, it gives you an immediate toolkit.
Yeah, like a checklist.
Right. So the next time you read or hear an analysis of, I don't know, anything complex, a political movement, a new tech trend, whatever.
You'll have specific things to watch out for. You can ask, is this maybe falling into one of these traps?
Spot on.
Okay, so let's build that toolkit then. Let's really unpack this critique and look at the specific categories of errors it highlights.
All right. The first category the critique really zeroes in on is what it calls secular bias and reductionism.
Secular bias and reductionism. Okay, so how does the critique explain that? What does it mean in this context?
Well, it's basically about framing deeply held religious beliefs, primarily, or maybe only, through lenses like sociology, politics, economics.
Or psychology, maybe.
Yes, exactly. And in doing that, it tends to downplay or even ignore the actual spiritual motivations or experiences that might be central for the believers themselves.
So it reduces something complex, like faith, down to just its material or social function.
That's the idea, reductionism. The critique gives some examples, like the secular analysis talks about how Pentecostalism offers material benefits or social support, especially for the poor.
Which might be true as an outcome.
Right, it might be an outcome. But the critique says the way it's framed can imply these benefits are the only or the main reasons people join or stay. It kind of overlooks the possibility of genuine spiritual seeking, a desire for God or experiences they interpret as divine encounters.
It misses the why from the inside, focusing only on the what from the outside. Makes sense.
Yeah. Another thing the critique flags under this heading is language, the words used.
How so?
It points to the secular analysis apparently using some pretty loaded, even pejorative terms. The example given is describing Christian Zionism among some Pentecostals as a creepy obsession with Israel.
Ooh, yeah. Creepy obsession is definitely not neutral language.
Not really. The critique argues that using a term like that doesn't actually engage with the theology behind it. The beliefs some Christians hold about biblical prophecy and the modern state of Israel.
Whether you agree with the theology or not, just calling it creepy dismisses it without actually examining the belief itself.
Exactly. It's reductionist language. It frames the believer negatively instead of engaging the idea.
Okay. What else falls under reductionism?
The critique also mentions how the secular analysis discusses spiritual warfare. It apparently describes the belief accurately, that believers think demons and evil spirits intervene.
Right.
But the critique argues it then stops short. It doesn't really explore the internal logic of that belief system, or, crucially, the sense of empowerment or meaning it might provide to believers facing hardship.
So it just states the belief as a sort of odd fact without exploring its significance within their worldview.
Pretty much. It describes the what they believe in demons, but not the why or the what it means for them. That's reductionism, again. Boiling it down without the lived reality.
Okay, that's clear. Moving on then. The second type of error the critique points out.
Faulty assumptions.
Faulty assumptions. So this is about starting points that aren't necessarily true.
Yeah, exactly. Proceeding from unstated ideas or premises that the critique argues just aren't accurate or maybe aren't universally applicable to the group being studied.
What kind of assumptions did the critique find in this secular analysis?
Well, one big one it mentions is assuming uniformity, or, monolithicism.
Treating the whole group as if they're all the same.
Right. The critique notes that early on, the secular analysis seems to generalize really broadly about Pentecostalism, like it's one single thing. It might mention diversity later on, sure.
But the initial impression is set.
Exactly. The critique feels those early broad brush assumptions kind of stick, and they paint a misleading picture of what's actually a hugely diverse global movement.
Okay, assuming everyone thinks and acts alike. What other assumptions?
Another one the critique flags is assuming negative intent. This comes up particularly with the description of the Seven Mountain Mandate.
Ah, yes, the Seven Mountains. That's the idea some Christians have about influencing key areas of society, government, media, education, etc., with Christian values.
Right, exactly. Thanks for adding that. So the secular analysis apparently describes this as repackaged Christian dominionism.
Which sounds pretty negative.
It does, and the critique argues this framing assumes the motives are primarily about seeking power, maybe even in a negative way. It potentially overlooks that adherents might genuinely believe they're working for the good of society based on their understanding of biblical principles.
Even if others strongly disagree with those principles or methods.
Right. The point is, the analysis assumes the why is basically sinister without fully exploring the believer's stated intentions or self-understanding.
And there was another assumption mentioned. About agency.
Yes, assuming a lack of agency or critical thought among the adherents.
How did that show up?
Well, the critique suggests that the way the secular analysis discusses people joining for material benefits, or maybe being easily swayed by emotional preachers.
It can imply they aren't really thinking for themselves.
Exactly. It implies they're just passive recipients, not individuals making active choices based on genuine thought, spiritual reflection, or personal conviction. The critique suggests this overlooks the discernment many adherents actually practice.
Okay, that leads us pretty naturally into the third type of error the critique identifies. Factual errors or significant overgeneralizations, misrepresentations.
Yeah, this one's maybe more straightforward. It's about getting facts wrong or maybe painting a really incomplete or skewed picture because of a lack of nuance, just misrepresenting things.
Right. What were some examples the critique pulled out?
One pretty striking one, according to the critique, is a claim in the secular analysis that fewer and fewer people within the movement practice speaking in tongues today.
Speaking in tongues, glossolalia, that core Pentecostal practice of inspired utterance.
Exactly. The critique argues this is a huge claim about really central practice. And it asks, where's the broad evidence for this supposed decline? Especially if you look at the massive classical Pentecostal denominations around the world, where it's still very common and important.
So it feels like an overgeneralization, maybe based on a limited slice.
That's what the critique suggests, yeah. Another one flagged was about vaccine hesitancy. The secular analysis apparently stated something like, physical illness is sometimes seen as spiritual sickness, even discouraging vaccines.
Okay.
And the critique's point here is that this is a massive overgeneralization.
Yeah.
Yes, some individuals might hold views like that, maybe linking illness purely to spiritual causes and rejecting medicine.
But not everyone.
Not by a long shot, according to the critique. It notes many Pentecostals absolutely use modern medicine alongside prayer. So, attributing widespread vaccine hesitancy across the whole movement just to a belief about spiritual sickness without more specific evidence, well, the critique says that's problematic. It misrepresents the diversity of views.
That makes sense. Nuance is key there. Any others?
Yeah, another claim was that Kingdom Now theology is replacing older end times views.
Kingdom Now. That's the idea about establishing God's kingdom on earth now, before Christ returns, right? Contrasting with views maybe more focused on the end times, the rapture.
Spot on. The critique argues that saying it's replacing the older views is just too strong. It's probably more accurate to see Kingdom Now as, an emerging stream or something coexisting alongside lots of diverse traditional views.
So replacing implies a takeover that isn't necessarily happening. It's more complex.
Right, it misses the complexity. There was also a small semantic point the critique raised about the secular analysis calling Pentecostalism a religion.
Instead of a movement or branch within Christianity, which is the religion.
Exactly. A point about just being precise with categories.
And maybe the biggest factual claim the critique challenged
was the statement that Pentecostals are overtaking Catholics in pure numbers in Brazil.
Wow, that's a bold demographic claim.
It is. And the critique essentially says, look, a definitive statement like that needs really solid, up-to-date demographic data, robust statistical backing. It questions whether the secular analysis actually provided that level of proof for such a major claim.
Yeah, demographic shifts are complicated. You need good data. Okay, so that's factual errors and overgeneralizations. What's the fourth type?
The fourth step is logical errors.
Okay, so this is about the reasoning itself being flawed.
Exactly. How conclusions are drawn from the evidence presented, the logic used.
Like jumping to conclusions, maybe.
That's one kind. A key logical error the critique highlights is hasty generalization.
We touched on this a bit with overgeneralizations, but how is it a logical error specifically?
Well, the critique argues the secular analysis takes the actions or maybe the extreme views of a few individuals, like, say, some unscrupulous preachers associated with the prosperity gospel.
Or fringe elements expressing violent ideas.
Right. And then it attributes those specific negative things to the entire diverse movement. The critique points out this is logically unsound, especially since the analysis itself might acknowledge the movement's diversity elsewhere. You can't logically tar everyone with the same brush based on a few examples.
So taking the worst cases and illogically applying them to the whole group.
Precisely. The critique also sees what it calls a straw man argument. This came up again regarding the Seven Mountain Mandate.
How is that a straw man?
The critique suggests the secular analysis might be presenting the mandate only in its most extreme, perhaps power-hungry interpretation.
Making it easier to attack.
Exactly. By focusing only on that potentially negative version, it becomes an easier target, a straw man, to knock down. And in doing so, it might ignore or downplay other motivations adherents might have, like wanting to serve society or build institutions based on their values.
So it critiques a simplified, perhaps distorted version of the beliefs, not the full picture.
That's the critique's argument. It also points to guilt by association.
How does that play out?
It mentions linking the entire movement to specific negative events, like the January 6th riots in the U.S., through something like the Seven Mountain Mandate, just because some individuals involved might have held those beliefs.
So because a few people believe X and did Y, everyone who believes X is somehow responsible for Y.
That's the flawed logic, yes. The critique argues it's a major leap. Showing that some individuals involved held certain beliefs doesn't establish a causal link or imply endorsement by the much, much broader movement that might share some theological ideas but had nothing to do with the event.
Okay, that's a clear logical fallacy. Anything else under logical errors?
One more significant one mentioned is the leap from the belief in spiritual warfare directly to the conclusion that this belief creates a darkly violent place that can justify violence.
Whoa, that sounds like a big jump.
The critique calls it just that, a major logical jump. It argues that simply believing in spiritual warfare, the idea that unseen evil forces exist and are active, doesn't automatically translate into believing in or justifying physical violence.
The two aren't necessarily connected.
Right. The critique implies that concluding the belief inherently leads to violence requires much more evidence. Evidence of a widespread causal link or specific theological teachings within the movement that explicitly use spiritual warfare to justify physical violence. Without that, it's a logical leap based on assumption.
That's a really important distinction, separating a core belief from a potential, perhaps extreme, interpretation or action by a small minority. Okay, fifth and final type of error.
The last category the critique discusses is epistemological errors.
Epistemological. Okay, that sounds academic. What does it mean practically?
It's about the theory of knowledge, basically. So here it relates to problems in the very approach the analysis takes to understanding and presenting information about its subject, how it knows what it claims to know and how it shares it.
Okay, so problems with the how of the analysis. What's the main issue flagged here?
A really significant one the critique points to is a lack of insider perspective, or what academics sometimes call an emic view.
Emic, like from the inside, as opposed to
etic, which is the outsider's analytical perspective. The critique argues the secular analysis relies almost totally on that outsider etic view. It describes beliefs and practices from the outside.
But maybe doesn't convey what they actually mean to the people inside?
Exactly. It fails to capture the meaning, the internal coherence, or the deep spiritual significance these things hold for adherents.
Can you give an example?
Sure. The secular analysis apparently mentions that direct experience and personal interaction with God's presence is important in Pentecostalism, which is true, it's central.
Right.
But the critique notes it doesn't really explore the profound existential meaning this has for believers. It might just say something like, oh, this is suited for the modern era, but it doesn't get into the subjective, often transformative reality of that experience from the believer's point of view.
So it describes the concept but misses the lived experience.
That's the argument. The critique also brings up selective framing and sensationalism.
Focusing on the juicy bits.
Kind of, yeah. According to the critique, the secular analysis tends to highlight the more controversial or sensational aspects. You know, the creepy obsession language we talked about, the darkly violent place idea, maybe even mentioning fringe practices that aren't representative of the whole.
Like snake handling or something, which is tiny minority practice.
Potentially, yeah. Things that grab attention. The critique argues that even if some positive aspects are mentioned somewhere in the analysis,
this selective focus on the sensational stuff can really skew the overall perception.
precisely, it gives undue weight to the extremes and can shape how a reader understands the entire movement.
Presents the most dramatic parts, which then color everything else. Makes sense.
And one final point under epistemology, an over-reliance on secular explanations.
What does that mean exactly? It's a secular analysis. Isn't that expected?
Well, yes, but the critique's point is about the starting assumptions. While sociological, political, psychological factors are absolutely relevant for analyzing any human movement, the critique argues that an approach that begins by effectively excluding or minimizing the possibility that genuine spiritual experience could be a primary motivator. Well, that approach is inevitably going to produce a skewed or incomplete understanding when you're analyzing a religious movement.
Because it rules out one of the potential core drivers from the get-go.
Exactly. It limits the explanatory framework it's willing to consider right from the start.
Okay, so if we tie all these threads together, the critique is basically saying that while this specific secular analysis might have identified some valid points about, say, Pentecostalism's growth, or some key beliefs, or the social support it provides, or its diversity.
Right, it wasn't all wrong.
But its major shortcomings, according to the critique, stem from these patterns we've discussed.
Yeah.
Reductionism, faulty assumptions, factual errors or overgeneralizations, logical leaps, and this lack of insider perspective or nuance.
Yeah, that sums it up well. And what's so incredibly valuable here, going back to our goal, is that understanding these 5 types of errors, the secular bias reductionism, the faulty assumptions, the factual mistakes, the logical fallacies, and the epistemological issues.
It gives you, the listener, that powerful framework we talked about.
Exactly. It helps you become a more critical consumer of information. When you encounter any analysis of a complex topic, religious, political, cultural, whatever, you can now actively look for these potential weak spots.
You can ask those concrete questions. Is this analysis maybe simplifying things too much? Are they making assumptions they haven't stated or justified? Are the facts solid, or is it painting with too broad a brush? Does the conclusion actually follow from the evidence, or is there a logical jump?
And maybe most importantly, am I getting the whole story here? Is it missing how the people involved actually understand themselves and their own motivations?
Yeah, thinking in terms of these error types lets you look beyond just what an analysis concludes and start examining how it got there. Where might its blind spots be?
It's about evaluating the quality of the analysis itself.
So what does this all mean for us? I think this deep dive into a critique really underscores how important it is to analyze the analyzer. It shows why we need to look beyond just surface-level explanations, why we need to be really wary of overgeneralizations, check the assumptions, check the logic.
And actively seek out multiple perspectives, especially, as you said, how people understand themselves within their own context. That's crucial for grasping any nuanced human phenomenon.
Absolutely. So this leaves us and leaves you with a really important question to think about.
The next time you read an article or hear a discussion analyzing a belief system, a cultural group, maybe a political movement, anything complex involving human motivation, what specific signs or patterns, based on what we've discussed today, might you look for first?
What questions will you ask yourself about their approach to see if it might be falling into some of these common analytical traps? Something to keep in mind.